I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by James Boyle, the William Neal Reynolds Professor of Law at Duke Law School and founder of the Center for the Study of Public Domain. He was one of the original board members and served as chairman of the board of Creative Commons, as well as the co-founder of Science Commons. Professor Boyle was awarded the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Pioneer Award for his work on digital civil liberties. He also received the World Technology Network Award for Law and his work on the public domain and the second enclosure movement that threatens it. James is the author of numerous books and articles on intellectual property, internet regulation, and legal theory, and his latest book is entitled The Line: Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Personhood, which we're discussing today. So James, welcome. It is a true pleasure and honor to have you with me, sir.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tim. Although that introduction makes me sound far more impressive than I actually am, and I would ask your listeners to just discount it all. I mean, after an introduction like that, I can only disappoint.
Well, again, you have been fighting for civil liberties on the web for decades, and I think that is the important part, right? Supporting the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I mean, these are big things that are protecting our rights and setting standards, right, for freedom, transparency, privacy, and access online. So
yeah, I mean, I certainly am a big supporter of EFF. Others have done far more with it. My own work has been mainly with Creative Commons and organizations like that. But I donate to EFF, and everybody else should too. They're a wonderful organization.
Yeah. Well, so I want to jump right into your new book, The Line. What is this book about? Why should people be reading it? And what inspired you to start this?
That's a great question, and it's a surprisingly hard one to answer. I mean, if you go back far enough, it's like because I was a little shy, well, actually not that shy, but maybe socially not well-adjusted child reading science fiction. You could come forward to the late 80s, early 90s, and I thought to myself, I've been reading Bruce Sterling, I've been reading William Gibson. I think this worldwide computer network thing's going to be kind of a big deal. Why don't I get in on the ground floor and start thinking about the legal aspects of it? And that worked out okay for me. And I thought, well, what might be the next thing? And it seemed pretty obvious to me that it would be AI. So in 2011, I wrote my first piece on whether or not we would ever give rights to artificially created entities, particularly artificial intelligence. If so, how or why we might do so, whether it would be a mistake, what tests we would have, and so forth. And the article was received politely, but I think with complete incomprehension by most of the lawyers and judges and law professors I presented. Very interesting arguments, they said, obviously backing away nervously, thinking that I was completely deranged. And I guess since 2011, maybe I've started to seem slightly less deranged, or at least the questions seem slightly more salient.
Yeah. I have been excited about AI since I read The Age of Spiritual Machines by Ray Kurzweil. And I think I read that back in 2000. So we're going on 25 years now.
That's a long time.
I've been chomping at the bit. And surprisingly, his predictions are pretty much on track from what I can see. I was just reading about some of the AGI stuff for interview questions on this, and they're saying it parallels more or less what he predicted 25 years ago. It's amazing.
I mean, I think Mr. Kurzweil is probably still much more optimistic than I am. My position is much more sort of agnostic. All I say in the book is, if I can convince you that there is a reasonable likelihood that reasonable people who understand computer science and so forth think there's a reasonable likelihood that within our lifetimes we might have a world in which, again, reasonable people disagree about whether or not a particular entity has some form of consciousness or whether or not a particular entity is deserving of rights. If that's even a reasonable possibility that we might have that disagreement within our lifetimes, then then I've satisfied the floor of credibility for my book. And I think we're there. I mean, I think we already have people mistakenly right now saying that the AI systems they encounter are conscious. And I think that that's only going to increase. And as the technology changes, perhaps they'll stop being quite as mistaken.
Yeah, this is a brand new the undiscovered country, as they might call it, and there is so much confusion. And I think when it comes to the topic of personhood, there is also a lot of contentiousness surrounding that. And again, that is kind of the core focus of this book. You're looking at that from a legal perspective. So we're talking about this contentious legal definition that involves the rights of not only human beings, but also corporations and animals. You've discussed the question of when life begins and ends. And in the past, this is something that we've denied to members of our own species. So this is a complex legal topic, right?
A complex legal topic. For me, I think we have to look at it as both legal and moral, in part because morality is the kind of loam, the substrate in which our legal rules will eventually grow, we hope. In part because we want to do the right thing. And in part, and this is why I also turn to issues of literature, science fiction, imagination, because we try out hypotheticals with ourselves, with each other. We have Star Trek and Mr. Data deciding whether or not he should get rights. And effectively what we're doing is little hypotheticals, like the ones you would have in a class, where we're saying to ourselves, well, if we had an entity with X qualities, would I have to recognize X as a person? And my point is that even in our own lifetimes, this has dramatically changed. When I was born, death meant your heart stopped beating. That was it. That was our measure of death, right? That seems prehistoric. Then we said, well, no, it's not heart. That's silly. What it is instead is brain function. Now we're proposing that it's particular brain functions. Not every brain function counts the same. And that's just in my lifetime. And that's a line that might seem easier and less contentious than, for example, when does life begin? Does it begin at conception? Does it begin at birth? Does it begin at viability? Which is a hugely contentious issue. And then, of course, we have corporate personhood. We have vast disagreements about this. I think less disagreement about whether or not corporations should have some form of legal personality. That I have a new risky technology. I want to form a limited liability company that takes on that project so that people can invest in that entity and the loss can be, or gain, can be controlled within that sandbox. That makes a great deal of sense, socially speaking. It's a great technology. That doesn't imply necessarily what rights we need to give to that corporation. Do we need to give it the rights of free speech? Do we need to give it the rights of equal protection? So it's not just that we disagree about personhood, but we disagree about what is incumbent upon personhood. And when I started the book, the question I was wanting to ask was, will artificially created entities, including transgenic species, ever be considered legal and moral persons? Will we view them as our peers? And then I realized about 5 years into the project that it was just as likely that we would learn an enormous amount looking at AI about ourselves. That in fact, the mirror would be looking back at us. And the analogy I'd use there is to the development of the theory of evolution. And, as we've read in our history books, during the Victorian era, this was a bombshell. Wait, I'm evolved from pond slime? But, what is my place in the world then? Am I really on top of the pyramid of beings? How can that be? Did God start the evolution? There are lots of people of faith who believe that, but then that requires, changing one's explanation of one's faith. What does it mean about my relationship to non-human animals? That was a huge disruption in our way of seeing the world. I think this could be an equivalent one. We'll see. I'm not sure.
This sort of goes off my questions, but some of the things that you touch on in this book, one of the things that occurs to me is that we're seeing almost a blurring of the definition of what it means to be human, right? And it used to be, you're a human being, you're a man or a woman. And almost in every area of society, like we have transgenderism now, which is changing the biological identity of what it means to be a man or a woman. So we've approached that. We're also seeing that animals, right, dogs, cats, horses, things like that, are far more sentient and aware than we have recognized in the past. And so that elevates them to some degree, I think. And I think that we're seeing some social change there. In addition to that, we are seeing artificial intelligence systems becoming more and more human and lifelike. And as you mentioned, transgenic species. And in the book, you go into Blade Runner, right, which talks about basically humans who are almost engineered to be robots. So we have all of these different categories that we could kind of fit into the human species. And what we viewed before, especially when these legal definitions were first established, don't fit the same way, right?
I think that's right. And just as your examples, as the examples you gave, people will have bristled at some of them. And I think that shows that we become very nervous when people start talking about our lines. And we can see that in many of our culture wars, that it is precisely the line that we want to say, wait, hold the line. This is a line I need to hold. This is a... And those lines might be around borders. They might be around gender. They might be around sexuality. They might be around the definition of humanity. They might be the line separating us from non-human animals. And in each of those, we have these, I think, quite passionate fights. And I guess it's impossible, as I say in the book, there are lots of ambitious things in the book, but getting rid of the shouting in the debate was always an unrealistic ambition. I don't expect to get rid of the shouting, but at least maybe to be a little calmer and more reflective and more open about those questions, so that we can say, before we sort of take up our cudgels, this is my tribe, I'm going to war on behalf of this, we can actually think through the issues. And perhaps it's better to do that before they are, hitting us right in the face. That it might be better to start thinking about this now and start thinking about, well, okay, let's think about it. ChatGPT is not conscious. What would it take me to think that an artificially created entity did, in fact, have consciousness like mine? Would it be, for example, that it learned not just through patterns of data, but through having encounters with the physical world in the same way that we do? Having little drones that learn about a chair not by looking at the dictionary definition, but by bumping into it, right? I mean, or would it be that we need to mimic our brain architecture or its complexity? And there are many, many possibilities, and I discuss some of them in the book. But my attempt is to start saying first, like, what would I need to be shown before we would start getting to the point of, now I'm morally troubled. Now I feel like I believe X, in all of situation X, where with the following capacities are there, I should have the following moral reaction, but that's not my reaction. And I want to have us engage with that earlier rather than later.
Well, you brought up an amazing point, which is a real curveball in this whole thing. The current test for AI is the Turing test, and LLM systems already passed this. And I think there's additionally kind of a second assumption that we will recognize true AGI when it arrives, right? I mean, the experts right now are saying, okay, that's not true artificial general intelligence. As you mentioned, it is probably on its way, but how do we even know when it gets here? That's a concern.
That's a great point. I mean, I think the Turing test is dead, and it's not dead actually because there were philosophical objections made to it. John Searle has this very famous hypothetical about a man who doesn't speak Chinese but is given an elaborate set of rules about what to do when he gets ideographs of a particular shape and how to respond. And so he responds and passes back another slip, understanding neither of them. That's actually a great description of what ChatGPT does, right? It gives us what appears to be conversation, but is not. But Searle said, and that must always be true of all mechanical systems because only biology can be conscious. Well, as an explanation of why only biology can be conscious, just saying only biology can be conscious isn't a terribly convincing argument. Assuming your conclusion, one student once asked me, what's wrong with circular arguments? They're so tidy. And they are indeed tidy because the premise is the conclusion. So that's not satisfying. But Turing test is nevertheless dead. Why? Because 100 million people have had the experience of conversing with something that gives them relatively lifelike responses back. So at the very least, we've had to understand something that since Aristotle, I think we have thought was uniquely ours, which is language is no longer our own preserve. We have to say sentences do not imply sentience. And that is a sort of an explosive moment, because a lot of the stories we tell about why we're morally superior to other animals, for example, is because we have if we have language, extremely complex and abstract language, and their languages are, while they exist and can convey meaning, are not that complex. Aristotle actually said that's the basis of what makes man man, because language enables prudential reasoning. I'm hungry. I see a grape. I can't reach it, but if I stood on that log, I could. But also moral reasoning. Wait, it's my neighbor's grape, and he might be hungry too. Maybe I shouldn't eat it. And that's what makes us us, as opposed to the lion that is never going to debate the ethics of being a carnivore. And that was a really convincing argument. And honestly, we haven't done that much better philosophically. We have improved the definition, to be sure. But I mean, 2,300 years ago, and we haven't, dramatically shifted it. Now we've got to this point where sentences don't imply sentience. And now we have to say, wait. What we meant was sentences backed by intentionality. Like an inner life. When you talk to me, I actually, perhaps I'm wrong, assume that there is a real Tim Ventura with an actual rich life, a family with hopes and dreams who speaks to me, and I get some tiny fragment of that in the fleeting moments of our conversation, and I project those things to you and you to me. Now, the thing about, with ChatGPT is that's not true, but could it ever be? And that's the question that I'm trying to get to in the book. And I think if you at least admit that it's possible, and now surely we have to think that it is possible, then these are questions we have to face now.
Absolutely. And Google DeepMind founder Shane Legg believes that there is a 50% chance the AGI will be achieved by 2028, and Elon Musk has predicted full AGI by 2029, and I have heard other people suggest that it may come even sooner. So these questions are very, very timely. Even if they don't apply to ChatGPT, these are going to be sideswiping us unless we have an idea how to approach them.
And
right?
I will say one thing there, which is that the technical definition of AGI, which comes from the very birth of the field of artificial intelligence, is machines that can do all that a man can do. That was the original formulation by the founders in the 50s. It is quite possible we could have a machine or machines that could do everything that a human being could do. Make up a nursery rhyme to tell to a child, pilot a plane, assemble a complex model car. There are tests, as you probably know, in these online prediction markets of what would constitute an AGI. One of them is putting together a complex model car, which I could never assemble. So I'm right out. I fail right from the beginning. I'm never going to get my humanity recognized. But even if it could do all of those things, those tests actually don't look at consciousness or intentionality. So we could have extremely competent, multi-factor expert systems that are what some of these people are referring to as AGI, and they still might not be conscious, which is more what I'm looking at. Or to put it another way, they might not have the moral components that would matter to us. It's like you fly a great plane and you can make a great sonnet and that souffle was delicious, but you're just a fancy ChatGPT. That might constitute AGI. It wouldn't necessarily meet my full definition.
Well, this goes back to language use, right? And for me, this takes me back to kind of the animal argument that AGI systems may be sentient, they may be conscious in the future, but they may not be designed to use natural language processing like ChatGPT is, right? So we have millions of people out there who may or may not think that ChatGPT is sentient because it's good with natural language. We could potentially have AGI systems that are sentient, that don't speak well, And for me, this again harkens back to dogs and cats, which I think are a lot more sentient than we like to admit, but they don't use language, right? So
in the book, I discuss a book by Samuel Butler called Erewhon. Samuel Butler was a Victorian novelist, read The Way of All Flesh. And if most of the watchers of your show would know him best probably through the novel Dune and the phrase the Butlerian Jihad, which was the war against sentient machines, which in his fictional universe had happened some time ago and was a prescription. The reason they call it the Butlerian Jihad is because Butler, in this book written in the 1870s, starts saying, and he's actually doing it tongue-in-cheek as a commentary on evolution, funnily enough, but a lot of sort of geeks just took it at face value. He said, look how fast machines are evolving. One day they might be conscious. We should ban that now. And so from that came the Butlerian Jihad. Sadly, Timothy Chalamet's elegant cheekbones never got to actually pronounce those words in the ChatGPT era movie version, which I think was honestly a just enormous failed opportunity. Timothy Chalamet going Butlerian Jihad would have been, I think a cinematic marvel. But to come back to your point, Butler was doing this, and he was doing it tongue-in-cheek, I think, to tweak his Victorian freak-out-over-evolution audience. He said, even a potato in a cellar has a certain low cunning. It just extends a root here or there because there's sunlight here or there. It says, I will overshadow this neighbor and take his resources, and this one will overshadow me. The potato says this by doing it, which is the best of all languages. If this is not consciousness, says Butler, what is consciousness? And of course we go, no, the potato isn't conscious, although your vegetarian and vegan listeners may now be looking uneasily at their French fries. But clearly the lines that we have drawn, particularly the lines we've drawn with non-human animals, recent ethological studies have shown us just how capable they are. And again, what did that prompt? It prompted enormous anxiety. The line is being challenged. And so one of the things I discuss in the book is how the future discussions about the line will get dragged into those old debates, and how your position on one might end up determining your position on the other. So you end up going, wait, if I accept this is conscious, then that's going to mean that my position on abortion is challenged. So therefore I reject the consciousness argument, or the contrary, right? So I think there's multiple interlocking dependencies here that we've really only begun to think about.
Absolutely. Well, and again, this broadening of what it means to be a person may include androids and machines, bioengineered life forms, even potentially extraterrestrial entities like Mr. Spock, which I think is something that you've touched on in the book. So we can no longer see ourselves alone in terms of sentience. And I'm wondering if that will lead to a backlash, and are we in some kind of a new Copernican revolution?
Well, that's certainly one of the claims in the book. I mean, again, going back to the analogy with evolution, which was, I think, for the people living through it, just a profound, it rearranged their mental furniture in ways that they found deeply disturbing. I think this may do that with us. What I would hope for is that this makes us deeper and richer and more compassionate as moral beings, that we realize that there is much more that unites us than divides us, that we see the common humanity I've been rereading W.H. Auden, who was writing at the rise of fascism, and September 1st, 1939, despairing in a New York dive, writes the line, "We must love one another or die." That line's always been intensely powerful to me. And it seems to me that it's possible that the arrival of these entities could make us realize how much we share, rather than, as I'm sad to say we're currently doing, finding how much divides us, drawing further lines, walls, barriers, saying, no, only my tribe, ever more narrowly defined, is the true X. And of course, the other possibility is the one that you raised, which is that it might actually produce an even more xenophobic backlash, an even more, human first, earth first kind of reaction. And I discussed that in the book as well.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask about personhood as what appears to be a matter of convenience more than science, at least in the past. And this goes to this idea of corporations being considered people so they can make contracts, sue or be sued, animals not being granted personhood, despite, again, feeling emotion and mastering skills required for their ecological niche. And in the past, I may be mistaken on this, but from what I understand, women and people with skin colors weren't considered persons, or were at least seriously curtailed in their legal abilities, right?
Certainly curtailed in their legal person. I mean, slavery is, of course, the ultimate denial of personhood. I literally take a person and decide to treat them like a chattel. I mean, I turn a person into a thing, and it's a legal move and a move of enormous inhumanity. Yeah, no, that's. I mean, obviously we have done that in the past. In the book, so your question nicely brings up sort of the two tracks of the book. One track of the book is to ask how our morality and our empathy might lead us to recognize some form of personhood, some form of moral right in an artificially created entity. But the other track of the book is to say, well, actually, we might end up giving legal personhood to AI, not because we see our common humanity beneath the metallic carapace, but because it's convenient, because we want to be able to sue someone when the self-driving car goes off the road, because we want a place to hold the assets. Or, and I think this is already happening, because the AI is already making the decisions for, let's say, a corporation at a speed that no human being could do. So that, in fact, the algorithm is calling the shots, even if it's Tom in the corner office who gets to put his name on the quarterly reports. And that's happening now with decidedly non-sentient, like rapid stock trading programs, for example, that are trying to do arbitrage at light speed to beat the market. And that's not conscious at all. It's certainly possible, and without any kind of consciousness behind it, that you could imagine expert systems that run corporations better than fleshy human beings. And then the question would be, do we want that entity to be the one that we consider the person? Is it like the hand in the sock puppet, so that we recognize the personality of the corporation, but really the hand inside the corporation is the AI underneath it? Do we continue to use sort of humans as frontmen, so sort of like we're the spokesperson for the AI behind? Or do we say, we think there are ethically troubling issues here. We think we want to regulate these entities in a particular way. We actually think maybe they deserve certain kinds of protections. And we're going to craft a special kind of right personhood for them in the same way that partnerships are different than limited liability companies. We'll craft this, and then from B Corps, we'll have this special protection for AIs. And I think any of those are possible. And when I turn to the history of how we had, in fact, got to our current law about corporate personality, and in particular, constitutional rights given to corporations, the beginning of the journey is, as I show in the book, was basically made, as the very conservative Justice Rehnquist said, one of the most conservative justices we've had on the Supreme Court until recently, said, we made this momentous decision with neither argument nor discussion. And it's true, the Supreme Court kind of backed into it and then has been citing ever since a case in which it really didn't decide that. And I guess I'm saying, if we're going to make these decisions, and it seems to me we have to, let us make them mindfully, and let us make them transparently, and let us make them with people having an informed reason to think, yeah, this is a better way to go than this.
Absolutely. Well, when I was researching these questions, I was trying to think of some of the different cases. And again, you've touched on so many of them in the book. And I was like, is there a way to come up with kind of a special circumstance that might apply to artificial intelligence? Now, I could be mistaken on this, but I'm wondering if we could take a lesson from personhood by the way the law treats minors. I have a teenager at home, right? And nobody would say that she isn't a person, but I think everybody would recognize that she's not able to make fully informed decisions yet. And so in the case of minors, we limit their autonomy to try and protect them, right? Which is very different than the example we talked a moment ago about in terms of slavery. In this case, we're saying, okay, we've created kind of a sandbox because we recognize that they are not quite there in terms of sentience, or perhaps not processing in the same way as a legal adult, right? Or a legal person. Do you think that there might be something there?
Definitely. It's one of the possibilities. I said, so I mean, think of the way we treat non-human animals. Even though we don't grant them any form of personhood, there are cruelty to animals laws that try and recognize they are at least, that they're deserving of a different level of moral consideration than, let's say, a rock or a piece of wood. Yeah. Right. So already we're moving up the stage. Then you get to the point that you mentioned. So we have lots of classes of people who have, mental disabilities, people who are in comas, children. All of these are recognized as persons, but we've tried to come up with systems where their interests are protected by a parent, by a guardian ad litem, or what have you. And any of these might be applicable here. It seems to me that even if we did move towards personhood for AI, we would do so in stages, where at first there was a sort of kind of semi, demi, hemi, sort of partial recognition of personhood before we got to the full thing, and people would be debating, is this enough? In the same way as they debated whether or not civil unions were adequate for gay couples, or whether full marriage needed to be extended to them. And I think we will have exactly the cognate kinds of debates, exactly the same kinds of debates about AI. So I definitely think that we will have that. It's interesting. There are already ethicists writing, say, the appropriate way to treat machines is as our slaves. And they use that term. And it's a striking phrase. It's sort of like, because they're saying we're human and we have real interests, real moral concerns. They don't. And basically, we should arrange everything so that they do what they do for us. And that's the only way of doing it. This is bioethicists, right, who are actually writing this and, arguing this. So I think the range of the possibility runs all the way from obedient slave who is punished unless it does what we want, all the way to the idea of full personhood, with many intervening stages along the way. And that's actually one of the things that I think is sort of most interesting about this process, is that in doing the research for this, and it was a surprise to me, I became convinced that in terms of non-human animals, certain non-human animals, I'd pick the great apes and the cetaceans, we should give them greater legal protection than we currently do. That they actually have so many of our cognitive sort of features. I think they've convincingly been argued to see, have things like regret, to plan for the future, to imagine the future, to grieve, to feel social dissociation. A life sentence means nothing to someone who has no sense of the passage of time. Every day is just a day. They clearly have a sense of the passage of time. Being locked in a room and never any prospect of escaping is a different thing for an entity like that. I came out of it thinking, we need to treat the great apes and the cetaceans differently. That doesn't mean that I think that they should be out there voting. But it does mean that they need some form of legal status, which is more than mere, don't just be cruel to them, right? I think we need something where perhaps they do need some form of guardianship.
Well, there's another aspect of this also when it comes to this idea of legal slavery. In the backstory to the Matrix, if I remember correctly, the machines rise up because they are treated poorly. They're treated like slaves. They have no options. And after a while, they just get tired of it, right? And if we're looking at true AGI, especially taking Ray Kurzweil into account, he's suggesting that we may have AGI that could outstrip human capacities millions of times over. I think that it may act the same way. At some point, if we don't treat it well, if we don't give it the same kind of recognition that we give other humans, it may just get tired of it and lash out.
Well, that's the self-preservation argument for it, which is, we don't want our robotic servants to turn on their masters. I personally am very nice to my Roomba vacuum cleaner and my Japanese toilet, which has artificial intelligence. I'm terribly polite to them. I'll still think I'm from the chop, come the revolution. I discuss the so-called doomer argument, the argument that very thoughtful people have raised, which is that having AGI will lead us inevitably to destruction, or that it at least has a huge risk of destroying the world, or at least destroying the human species. I think that it's funny. I think their concerns are overstated, but nevertheless ones we need to take into account. It's the precautionary principle. A tiny, tiny risk of a truly cataclysmic harm is something that you have to nevertheless take seriously. And I think they've established that point. What they haven't established, I think, is what some of them argue, which is it's absolutely inevitable that would happen. And I think just musing on our uncertainty about what an AI would look like. For example, many of them assume the real problem would be machines acting according to their programming in ways that humans don't anticipate. So the so-called paperclip problem, where the machine told to make paperclips turns the entire world, including us, into constituent parts, and there's all these paperclips floating in space. That assumes that what we have to worry about is the literal AI that obeys its instructions to our destruction. But we also obviously have the possibility of the AI who has emergent properties within its architecture, and we already have unforeseen capacities and tendencies coming up in our comparatively simple neural networks. And we have self-evolving networks, which is, parallel to evolution. So it's also the case that we might have entities, the goals of which we have no idea about. And if you can't even tell whether the thing that kills us is going to be the literalist or the rogue, then I think your ability to say confidently it will inevitably end in death is limited. But the precautionary principle is real. We should be very careful about this. And, we owe them a great debt of gratitude for making us take that thought seriously and thinking seriously about alignment and thinking seriously about the way we design it. Fully aware that there are lots of people in other countries also pursuing AI research who may not feel so ethically or legally constrained.
Wonderful. Well, James, let me thank you so much for your time today. Again, truly an honor. This is such an enormous subject. There are so many ramifications, so many things to work through, and you have covered so many of them in your new book, The Line, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Personhood. I'm going to drop links to the Amazon copy of this, as well as your website and other relevant resources in the show notes. Again, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this.
It is my entire pleasure, and I have to say, as the former chair of Creative Commons, while I'd love it if your readers bought the book, your viewers bought the book, they can download it for free because the entire book is available under Creative Commons license. Thanks so much, Tim.
Wonderful. Thank you again, sir.